Thank you very much. So before getting into the lecture itself, I wanted to send my compliments to all the lecturers that have presented up until now. And I'm really happy that I have seen the presentations, as I think they're a perfect representation of what I will share with you today. This is because I'm meaning to share with you the field of archaeology, mostly for the people that are not archaeologists per se, as I hope that this lecture will be a good base and a good fundamental overview of what archaeology is and how it can meet well the other fields. So in regards to what this lecture will be about, I've broken it down into 5 basic questions, which are the questions that you could ask in any specific field, but in this case, it's the who, what, when, why, and where. So this lecture will be divided into a set of objectives. So trying to understand the general picture of what archaeology is. Then I'll try and share with you how archaeological research is carried out and why we do what we do. Of course, we'll also look at the very basics of archaeological research, as archaeology is a massive field and there are subdisciplines on subdisciplines, and we'll only be able to touch some of them, not go in detail, and unfortunately we don't have the time to look at everything that's done within archaeology. But all in all, what I would like to share with you is the recognition of the importance of contextualizing archaeology within other disciplines. So trying to understand where archaeology fits and looking at how samples, materials, and abstract information from the past are actually studied and then applied to other disciplines such as genetics and linguistics. So the take-at-home message is not to become experts in archaeology or to understand every single thing that archaeological research entices, but what I would like for you non-archaeologists to do is to be able to read an archaeological paper and at least understand what is being discussed. So to start this lecture, the 2 most basic questions are the who's and why's of archaeological research. When we look at the who, of course, the first thing we think of is humans. After all, archaeology, it is about the study of the past of humans. However, there are many other aspects of our past that we have to look at to understand our living and our past on this world. This, of course, includes the fauna, the flora, and the earth itself, as archaeology entices a whole set of subdisciplines looking at various aspects of our world, and that, of course, also fall within other fields. When we look at animals and plants, we do archaeology, but together with zoologists, with ecologists, we might work with geologists to look at specific aspects of our past, such as dating or understanding climate in the past, and so on. So if we do want to understand archaeological research and the who, we do have to take into account everything. So that said, when we do try to understand the human past, and every time you will look into an archaeological question or an archaeological context, trying to understand why humans did what they did, you don't only have to think about the actual human act or the human activity, but you need to necessarily look at the other aspects of it. As humans are not self-sufficient, they do not just react within themselves in a vacuum, but they do act based on their environment and what they have around them. So of course, if we think about the who and the why, the next question is what? We do know that humans acted in the past, and this is our main concern, trying to better understand the past, of course, to better the future, but also simply to expand our knowledge. But now the question is exactly what do we see in the archaeological record? What do we want to see in the past? And what can we see? Because unfortunately, archaeology, although considered a science, is not a perfect science. We cannot repeat experiments. We cannot look at things twice, but we will get that much more in detail later on. But let's keep in mind these 3 basic questions, trying to understand how we look at what we look. So that said, archaeological research, I'm sure all of you, even the people that have never worked in archaeological contexts, every time you think about archaeology and archaeologists, you might think about excavating or unearthing specific discovery. Of course, this is not done out of thin air, and there are decades, if not centuries, of research to better our skills. And this is just to answer the question of where people were. And this is done with two methods that within it themselves, they are whole disciplines, which are survey and excavation. The objectives of these two methods that can be applied in a variety of ways, of course, are to understand where humans were. And the most basic type of answer we can use or we can have from these methods is survey. So just to give a basic description, a survey, it's any method that is non-intrusive, meaning that it does not disturb any context, and it has the objective to search and find archaeological sites and materials. This, of course, is done by collecting information, and the information can include the location of a site or a find, the distribution, therefore, how it's distributed, where it is, how far it is from other sites, therefore looking at within its context, and how it is organized, trying to understand, therefore, the organization of past human activities, sites, demographies, and so on. Therefore, as I said, there are different types of survey. The most basic one is simply a ground survey. It might look simple at first, but again, it's a whole science behind it. Ground survey simply entices the analysis of materials and sites walking on the ground. And as you can see in the upper left, field walking is where you basically just walk in a field. If you see anything that is anthropogenic, anything that's human-made, anything that looks interesting effectively is recorded. Other types, of course, of ground survey are not necessarily just little stone tools, for example, on the ground, and they can also mean finding entire structures, as you can see from the other photos. But this is the most basic form of archaeological research, and it's usually the very first step into archaeological projects. Another type, of course, of survey is aerial survey. This can be done in a variety of ways. Again, as you can see, we have different types from basic photographic survey, as you can see from the lower left, where you might recognize Stonehenge, to the most complex forms of survey in the upper right, where you can apply very complex technologies such as LiDAR technology using different types of radiations or wavelengths to therefore understand the morphology or the topography of the ground to see if there are any patterns in the ground that are not natural. And the whole point of this, therefore, is to find anything that is human-made or that was modified somehow by humans. Depending, therefore, on where you are in the world, again, there are many different ways. The most standard type you can see on the upper left it's a photo by Historic England, which are called crop marks, which are very beautiful, as a matter of fact. And the differentiation in color is given by crops growing at different rates, depending on what is underneath. But in some cases, you can't see that. And the image on the upper right, as a matter of fact, is a Mayan structure, set of structures, which were used with LiDAR, as I said, because of the thick forest sitting right on top. But of course, surveys are not just looking at the ground or looking at the ground through an airplane or any kind of method. There are many different types of surveys that are actually done within a single room, within an office. And these are also known as desk-based surveys or desk-based assessments, depending on when you are. And they take into account a variety of different methods of analysis. The media you use can be written. It can be, for example, a historic document. It could be graphics such as old maps, land properties, land registries, but it can also be really old photographs where you see, for example, landscapes before modern construction, or it can even be electronic with the modern databases, just looking through what has already been recorded. And another method of surveying, although it's less popular nowadays and it's much more difficult to double check and to evaluate, is simply word of mouth or stories, even though that's a whole presentation on its own. So desk-based surveys start with a variety of different types of sources, but they all use one single integrated system to put it together and give archaeologists and others, such as geographers or geologists, the possibility to analyze it in a much more streamlined and efficient way. These systems are GIS systems and also known as Geographical Information System. And it's basically a way to create, manage, and analyze any sort of data through maps. And with this, you can look at elevation, hydrology, topography, and so on. So as you can see, there are different types of surveys, and I'm not expecting you to understand everything or to know how every single little thing works. However, the most basic types are ground surveys, and they entice a specific type of sampling strategy, depending on what you prefer. So as you can see, sampling strategies is where you do ground survey of any kind, and you do find materials on the ground. And generally, especially for some sites with a really high concentration of materials, you tend not to collect everything for the simple reason that it's not good for the archaeological record to just destroy a whole context. So specific sampling strategies have been developed for this reason. As you can see, there are different types, either be random or systematic, and they can be simple or stratified and so on. Without getting into too much detail, this is here just to show you the complexity that can be behind something. And at the same time, many other types of surveying strategies exist. These are created through the development of different technologies. They've been developed through a very long time. And it depends also on which other fields you're collaborating with. The most common one is geophysical survey, which we will look into more detail, but it looks at the ground through physical properties of materials, whether it be the temperature of specific material, the electrical conductivity, or how much water it retains, or the magnetic properties, such as how much iron oxide is in a material. Other types can be of geochemical nature, therefore simply analyzing the percentage or concentration of phosphates, magnesiums, calcium, and lipids. One example of the use of geochemical survey that's very common, for example, in historic settings, is analyzing the phosphate concentration in the ground or in specific areas where phosphate is a natural outcome of animal urine. Therefore, in areas with high phosphate concentration, you could interpret it as an area where animals were consistently living on it for a prolonged amount of time. And finally, you have a variety of other sorts of surveying techniques using the identification and the properties of materials, such as petrology, therefore the study of minerals, the analysis of metal, of organic residues, and so on. But as I said, one of the most popular ones and also the most useful ones is geophysical survey. The beauty of these methods is that you are effectively doing a survey, therefore you're not disturbing the ground. However, you're looking under it. You're looking within the layers that you are not touching. And this is done in a series of ways, either looking at the magnetic field, as you can see on the lower left, or by resistivity or conductivity on the lower right. And I'm not going to explain how they work, but very simply, you can see any structure or specific feature of material under the ground. And usually this is not enough for a full interpretation of the site or the activity you're looking at, but it's usually more than enough to have a first good understanding of where you're standing or what you're studying. And this helps enormously with making your research and your analysis more efficient. So, of course, survey helps you understand some aspects of past activity on that specific area. However, as I said, it's not enough to exactly understand what was going on. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't give you much material either. So the next step is excavation. Survey and excavation go together like brother and sister. There will be a specific course I will be teaching later next week that is only about these two techniques. The reason why I wanted to give a whole lecture just about these two topics is because they're fundamental for the understanding of our past. I'm going to get into much more detail about this, but as you can see in this case, excavations and survey uncover all of the materials, or at least most of the materials that we usually use for other analyses. And once we take these materials from their original context, we completely lose any other information we could get. Once we remove a stone tool from the layer, we effectively eradicate it from its previous history, its previous story, and we make it something different. And this means that the most important thing, the most basic thing, is to record the excavation, record the survey. And if we don't know how surveys or excavations work, once we go back and look at that information, either published by someone else or in a simple report, we won't be able to gather the right interpretations. And the very basics of excavation is stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is the way archaeologists, it's a method archaeologists use to record the history of a site. This is a very complex, so to speak, stratigraphy, but it basically shows how different phases of a specific landscape sort of merge together to form a complex picture. Every little feature, every little wall, every little piece of pottery fits within this picture, and effectively the job of the archaeologist is to look at it and understand what happened. It's to reconstruct the story of a place and the story of the people that left there what we see. Stratigraphies exist in huge array of ways, and many methods can be used to study it. But what I would like for you to know is that stratigraphies break down into two basic types. The first one on the left is primary stratigraphy. This is where objects from the past and sediments, therefore soils from the past, sort of fall on top of each other in a regular manner, and they just stay there. They get stuck. And what an archaeologist then does is excavates through them and in a linear manner can look through layer by layer. The second type of stratigraphy is called the secondary. This is where at first you have a primary stratigraphy form, but after that, unfortunately, due to other events such as erosion from rain, for example, these layers that were originally sitting on top of each other get broken down. This means that the second type of stratigraphy, the secondary stratigraphy, can be way more complicated to understand, because even before understanding what is older and what is younger, we have to understand the processes that caused those materials to sit where they were. And this is a really important aspect to take into consideration when looking at archaeological literature. When you look at any publication that talks about an archaeological site, if everything has been published and recorded as a primary stratigraphy, you can be confident enough that what is said is what it was. However, for secondary stratigraphies, it's much more complicated. And usually those are the sites that have way more debate around them. That said, it's not only a matter of stratigraphy being simple or complex. There's also the excavation method itself that can be different depending on where you are, and can also give a very different interpretation of the site. These are the three basic excavation methods that are still used to this day. But the question is, which one is the correct excavation method? To answer this question, there isn't really a correct excavation method. It all depends on what you're excavating and in which conditions. So to start with, for example, an open air excavation, it's the most popular nowadays for academic or research type of excavations. And it's basically where you find a site, for example, this cave, this is a brick Romani. You find some lithics on the surface, you decide to excavate it, and you start digging downwards. And as you dig downwards, you dig the whole extension of the site. Therefore, in this case, for example, they excavated the whole cave, and rather than selecting a small area, they just excavated the whole site. So the pros of this methods are that you recover almost 100% of the materials found within the cave. Of course, the more materials you excavate, the more analysis you do, the higher the resolution, and therefore the better the interpretation and the more correct the interpretation. Of course, it didn't say 100% excavated, because as you can see on this little section, you have a column that has been kept intact from the original layers. And this is a testimony, basically a way to still analyze the stratigraphy, even though it's been fully cut. That said, another way of excavate, the con of this method, of course, because ideally we would always want to excavate in this way. Unfortunately, it's not possible. Therefore, what can be done to save time, as this is a method that takes a very long time usually to dig, and in this case, it's decades of work. If we do want to excavate an area, find out what's there, but we don't have enough time, for example, in commercial settings with building environments, for example, in archaeology settings where they are building a new set of houses and they send in the archaeologists to just assess what's there, the archaeologists won't have the time to excavate the whole area. So trenches are set. These are just very basic rectangular shapes, or they can be of different shape depending on the context, but usually they are just simple squares, such as pit excavations, or they can be full-on trenches, where you basically, after initial survey, generally after a geophysical survey, you decide a specific area and you dig just that. Of course, the pro is that it's a much faster way to excavate. You can work, you can do 2-3 trenches in a single day. But of course, at the same time, you do not see the whole site for what it is. You can only see little windows of the actual site. So it's about finding the best case scenario for yourself. The third and last excavation method, the Wheeler method, is a sort of mix between the two. This is actually one of the oldest excavation methods, and it takes into account the possibility of setting specific trenches in a grid manner so that you can both see stratigraphies, as you can see from these areas. So these would all be stratigraphies exposed, but at the same time, you have an excavation in a very wide area. This is sort of in between the two, and yet not being as good as either. Let me explain. The problem with this excavation method generally is that first, it takes a very long time to set up, and it might not work out as you wish. The second reason is because if you go through the amount of work to set this up, you might as well do an open excavation and leave testimonies. For example, just leaving specific columns here to assess the stratigraphy. Nevertheless, this is a method that nowadays is commonly used only at sites where they're still excavating from past decades and they just kept the methodology. One example would be Boxgrove in the UK. Nevertheless, it's something that's useful and hopefully interesting to take into consideration. The last type of excavation I would like to talk you about, it's completely different. As a matter of fact, is not even on the ground, it's underwater. Underwater excavation can take a variety of shapes depending on where you are, the context, and it's still quite a new method. As you can imagine, excavating underwater, it's not exactly the same thing. There are a variety of variables to take into account, time, conditions, just even the water movement doesn't make the soil sediment in a manner similar to the ground. The most common types are just explorations, where areas with some sediment in them or with materials are removed systematically, and that could be considered an excavation. But the proper excavations are these two examples that you see here. And as you can see, the grids are set up. They're removing materials with a specific system in mind. It's just very different. And as of today, underwater excavation hasn't reached the resolution of ground excavation, and it will most difficultly be able to do so. Nevertheless, one thing I would like to point out here that is very similar to the other methods is the recording that is being done. So even though you're underwater, even though the conditions are very difficult to work, they've taken the time to set up a grid, so to analyze the materials within each grid, and they're still taking notes. That's because undoubtedly the most important part of both survey and excavation is the recovery and recording of the materials. As I hinted to earlier, the recording is fundamental. The very first step of any archaeological investigation, whether it be in the field or in the lab, is the recording of what is being done and what is being found. Because as I said, once the materials are recovered, therefore removed, the original context is completely lost. To give you an example, this little flake comes from this context you can see here. So of course, this flake tells us a lot of information. However, when it used to be in situ, it would have given us even more. Things such as the correlation the flake has with other flakes, the orientation the flake has. These are all really important informations that if we didn't record when we were excavating this, at this point, we couldn't have known that. And these information are all really important for the later interpretations. Therefore, the suggestion I would make whenever you work with archaeologists or work in an archaeological context, always make sure that the recording and the recovering is done properly. Sometimes when not much time is required or when things are overlooked, it's easy to overlook at these small details, but these are the small details that do make a difference in the long run. So nevertheless, now that we know more or less how to recover materials and how to find out where information is, we have to take into account, or we have to consider when these things were deposited where they were. And this is probably the most important, or one of the most important questions in archaeology, as we're looking in the past, and we do have to understand what happened when. Just to put everyone on the same page, as I'm sure many people come from very different backgrounds, chronological scales, depending on the context or the area you work in, or even the place you work in, they come in many different names. So of course, one of the most known ones is the AD or BC nomenclature, which is typical of the Christian world. But of course, things like the Common Era CE or BC are used. And finally, the more scientific and most used one within at least archaeological literature is the purely chronometric scale, which is BP or CalBP when calibrated. So I'm showing you these just to tell you that when you see an age, it's not necessarily that specific age. It can change, and always double check which system is used to, if necessary, convert it to what you want it to be. And in regards to dating archaeology, in archaeology, that's a whole different field on its own. I'm not going to get into resolutions and chronometric scales. But what's important to notice is that there are two different dating methods. There's the absolute dating and relative dating. The earliest dating that was developed were different types of relative dating. The most common type of relative dating is seriation. Seriation is a way to date a site or date materials by reconstructing a history. To give all of you an example, if we did use cell phones, for example, if you imagine a really old cell phone and you imagine finding it in a stratigraphy, and then on top of it, you found a modern phone, an iPhone, for example, you would assume that the lower level is older than the upper level. This is basically what is done with seriation. People study pottery, they study lithics, they study all sorts of materials. They understand which one is older and which one is newer. And once you find those in a stratigraphy, you automatically know which layer, archaeological layer, is older and which one is newer. Unfortunately, this has its own problems because lithic doesn't shout at you, I'm 10,000 years old. This system is used similarly with the stratigraphical analysis or faunal analysis. For example, when you find a bone of an extinct animal and then you find a bone of a modern animal, you of course know that the layer with the extinct animal will be necessarily older than the modern one. And in turn, this is done also with pollen. Apart from relative dating, in the recent decades, a variety of absolute datings have been developed. And absolute dating is basically a method that tells you this is exactly this old, plus or minus, of course, with a standard deviation of or a variation of some kind. The most common one, for example, is radiocarbon dating. Nowadays is pretty common. Unfortunately, going back more than 45,000 years, it's not as useful anymore due to the half-life of C14. But then you have other types such as luminescence or ESR or other radioisotopic dating methods, which do give you dates that are much older than 45,000. And in this case, it all depends on where you are, how old the materials you're dating are, and also the actual materials you have. Just to give you an example, luminescence dating works with quartz and feldspar minerals. And of course, if you do not have those minerals in your site, you won't be able to date that way. So even though it's considered absolute method, it's not really absolute. As with everything in archaeology, at the end of the day, it depends on what you have on hand. And of course, as I said, other than a science, it's also an art to make the best with what you've got. So as we've seen these two different dating methods, we find a way to use them. We find dates, but it also depends on how we use those dates. Chronologies can be used in different manners. In archaeology, there is the really important point of understanding what you're looking at and the area you're looking at, because no matter how big the site you're working on is, you'll always have to see it within its larger or regional context. And this means that chronologies for single sites have to be put together somehow. And this is a difference between regional and absolute dating. To give you an example, we have here 3 separate sites. You can see on the left the stratigraphies. And to make it easier to understand, each little archaeological sample has a different color. Each color is a specific type of archaeological sample. So, for example, let's say type A, which is red, in site 1 is found at the very top of the site. In site 2 is found a little lower down. So what does this mean? That this layer is the same date as this? Well, not exactly. That's because if we do shift things to match, we end up with one absolute chronology. So now we have these materials that are the same age, and we might know from the C14 samples here. And similarly, we can say it here and here. So another important role for the archaeologist is to understand how different sites fit together. And for example, understanding different periods, not of a site, but of a whole landscape. And this is extremely important. And it is fundamental because then, for example, if you would like to understand migration routes or any kind of human dynamic, these are the periods that will then be used to understand what happened when. And talking about what, if we do know something happened in a specific date, we still have to understand what exactly we're looking at, because we started with survey, we went on to excavation. So we have a site, we found it, we excavated it, we know how old it is. But another fundamental part of archaeological research is the study of whatever has been excavated or whatever we have from specific site or context. And one of the most important questions for humans, for human research within archaeology, is to understand if something is effectively connected to human activity or if it's just natural. This is primarily dedicated to anyone that studies stone tools or lithics. As you can imagine, stones are everywhere and humans were everywhere. And it's not easy most of the times to understand who made what, either nature or people. So to give you an example, I have here 3 images of just rocks, and only one is made by humans. If you look at them, you might get an idea of which one was used. And as you can see, the one on the left was effectively not made by humans, but used by humans. And this is a very important thing to take into account. Many times when we do look at an archaeological site, when we do archaeological research, a lot of the information is present within a site, but we might not even be able to understand or to comprehend that humans were there and humans used what is there. So it's just to keep something in the back of your mind. Things such as, in this case, sample A, which is a hammerstone, therefore just a round stone that was used to knap and produce stone tools. Many times the human and natural worlds meld together, and archaeology is there specifically to make sure that we can gather as much as we can from our past. And this brings us, of course, to artificial material culture. So when archaeologists look at material culture and they look at anything that has to do with our past, with the human past, it comes in all sorts of shapes and forms. I'm not going to go into detail with these information. Feel free to download the PowerPoint from GitHub if you want to save these lists. But materials come in all shapes and forms. They can be stones in different ways, ceramics, bones, metals, and organics. And the analysis and equipment used can vary just as much. Of course, you can do direct dating of materials, but you can also use use-where methods that tell you how materials were used, or you can find any residues on them. And then, of course, you can analyze the type and the technology behind them, and so on. And all of these methods have primarily the objective to tell us more about human behavior. And this is an aspect that is much more difficult with all the material culture, therefore the objects used by humans that are purely natural. These materials such as geological samples or bones, for example, used for eating, and plant remains too, they are much more difficult to understand whether they had human interaction or not. However, nowadays we have a whole array of analyses that can be used to better understand the correlation between human and these materials. So this is a very, very quick and general description, and feel free to ask any questions more in detail about any of them. However, this is meant to give you an understanding of how wide the field of archaeology effectively is, but also how much information we can gather and how much information can be used not only for the bettering of the field itself, but can also inform other disciplines about human past. And this brings us to the subdisciplines of archaeological research. Of course, I just went through the most basic terms of archaeology, which in an undergraduate archaeology course would take a whole semester to explain. But I think it's also useful to understand what the main subdisciplines are, just to give you an understanding of what are the most important questions, or what are the things that interest archaeologists the most. So of course, the first one that is the most applicable to all of you is bioarchaeology or osteoarchaeology, depending on where you're from. And this is a study of any kind of human remain. This is really well linked with the archaeogenetics course, such as the discussion about morphology. These are just two of the most basic books about it. And it's probably one of the most simple to understand. It's basically the study of anything related directly to the human remains, whether it be bones, such as the skulls, or even, for example, charred human remains that tell us direct information about the individuals we are studying. Another really big discipline of archaeology is environmental archaeology. Within this, I include fields such as zooarchaeology, which is a study of animals or the fauna, paleobotany, which is a study of any plant remains, and you'll have some amazing lectures about this specifically later on. But you also have geoarchaeology, which studies specifically the geology of archaeological contexts, trying to understand how sites form, the sedimentation of the sites, and so on. And this environmental archaeology is a field which is meant to give more wide understanding of the environment that surrounded the people we look at. But at the same time, it's not specifically about the people connected to the land. It's just trying to understand the biological context of the past. That is because we have another subdiscipline, which is landscape archaeology, that looks specifically at the interaction between humans and their environment. This is a much more theoretical subdiscipline, but it basically takes information from environmental archaeology and it tries to make sense of it. So from an environmental perspective, landscape archaeology would try to understand how fauna and flora changes in time, and then tries to understand if people had an effect on that or if they caused some of the changes. Other examples would be geological landscape archaeology, where you try to understand if a change in topography, therefore the shape of the landscape, was caused by humans, or a much more direct type of landscape archaeology is the structural part, basically studying the creation of buildings and infrastructure. So trying to understand the landscape of where people lived seems quite direct, but again, as I said earlier, it depends on what you find. Many times you hope to understand how, for example, a forest changed in time, but you might not be able to find any paleobotanical or plant-based finds to help you with that. So one recent field that is currently growing at an amazing rate that helps us fill in those gaps is computational archaeology. Computational archaeology is a really wide term and can be used in a great array of ways and can be applied with so many different softwares and databases. But in its simple term, it's the application of any computer-based and analytical method. These go from the most simple univariate and multivariate statistics, but you also have much more complex models such as agent-based modeling, Bayesian analysis applied, for example, to dating, But at the same time, you can also start developing methods such as digital excavation, which is a very new thing that is going to grow more and more. But this is just to show that the field of archaeology is starting to move away from the pure find-based perspective, and it's starting to move towards a much more, excuse me, a much more wide open picture, and trying to fill in gaps that up until now they've been unfillable, and trying to have a better understanding of what we have and what we will have by implementing it computationally. So of course, there are other types of archaeological disciplines. One is the just theoretical or cognitive archaeology, which is just the study of the intellectual framework within which archaeology works. I'm not going to get into detail about this, as we may spend far too many days talking about it. But theoretical archaeology, just for reference, is studying how people thought and acted in the past and why they thought and acted in that way. But at the same time, equally as important, theoretical archaeology is about why we, as archaeologists, as academics, we think they thought and acted the way they did. And the whole premise of archaeological theory is not only studying the past, but also studying how we study the past. And this then gets into scientific philosophy, but it's something that's really important, at least in my opinion, to know, as it's a field that's been falling down quite a bit, bringing back scientific methods and giving more importance to scientific methods, but considering the trends of archaeology in the past, as theoretical archaeology started becoming less and less popular, in the near future is going to start becoming more and more popular again, especially with the introduction of computational archaeology and computational methods, where more and more data is derived from computational methods, and we'll start thinking more and more about why those things come up and how we had a role in having those specific results coming out. I hope that was clear enough, and I'm happy to discuss this more in detail. Nevertheless, one last and final really important set of archaeological subdisciplines, which I think will apply to all of you one way or another, is the basic distinction that we make of archaeology based on the time range. Therefore, I'm sure many of you, all of you must work one way or another with old materials or old contexts. And I'm sure most of you think, oh, I'm a prehistoric archaeologist or prehistoric scholar, or I'm a historic scholar. However, this distinction also means much more. They do have very different approaches. For example, trench versus open air, where in historic archaeology, very commonly you would use trenches, and in prehistoric, you would have open air. But at the same time, you also have very different material culture assemblages. For example, prehistoric archaeology is dominated by stone tools, while you might suggest that in certain historic contexts, you have mostly pottery, as I just explained. And at the same time, they have very different sources. Of course, the distinction between the names is based off of the fact that within historic archaeology or history in general, you have documentation, you have words, whether it be epigraphies or manuscripts and so on. While in prehistoric archaeology, you don't have anything of that kind, except for a few very rare cases. And this can therefore be, I think, many times erroneously considered as history versus no history, or prehistory as a matter of fact. However, what I would like to share with you, and I would like for you to start thinking, is why should we think of it this way? At the end of the day, there is no specific interruption between the two. Many times, even in published literature, we see studies where they talk about, oh, in the Paleolithic, this and this happened. And then in the Neolithic, there was this revolution. But was it really a revolution? Did the people during that time period, did they feel a revolution? Or was it simply a slow and steady evolution? So my answer I would like to suggest is that absolutely not. People are people. They go through generational developments like we do today, as a matter of fact. And it's, in my opinion, very dangerous to think as this division, and also to divide the methods, having methods specifically for one variation of historic or prehistoric archaeology, another for the other. So what I would like to share with all of you, and please keep it in mind whenever you're looking at anything that has to do with archaeology, is what changes is not how things were, but how we see them. So if we decide that there is a specific revolution or a specific change, a specific time, many of the times it might not be that way. So try to figure out whether the authors of a publication that say that that specific change happened that specific time, think about whether was actually there, or if the authors made it so that it looked like it was there. So one of the secrets of archaeology, you could also say in science or academia in general, is always critique yourself and everything you see, and always double check everything. And this is especially important with archaeology. So these are all the very basic aspects, and bringing it one step further. So trying to look not at what we do or what we study, but how we use it. Therefore, what are the interpretations that archaeology leads to? We have the study of people, environments, and objects. So as we saw, people can be studied in a series of ways, such as environments and also objects, also known as material culture. And these three things cannot be studied individually. They're part of a bigger picture. This is a really good paper that recently came out. I'm happy to send the PDF after this. And this is basically a very short premise on how everything fits together in a neat yet complex picture. And this is just for you to understand how sometimes we might see an archaeological paper and it might have one sentence results, a big claim, but many of the times there is so much more under it. And many of the times these things are unanswered because we can't answer them, that it brings everything to a big question mark. Another question that archaeologists love asking is the interaction between technology, movement, and interaction of people. One example of this is the development and analysis of technological tradition. For example, personal ornaments such as shell beads, or the use of eagle bones and so on. And this shows you the complexity, in this case, in Upper Paleolithic Europe. It shows the complexity of personal ornamentation and how things aren't really unique by themselves, but they're all interconnected. And yes, we can, in fact, find patterns, and we can find connections between movement of people and the interaction between people, but it's all part always of a bigger picture. And this is shown again with the application of the analysis of technological traditions in Africa, for example, where during the Middle Stone Age, or MSA, we have the distribution of stone tools, which all look very similar to one another if you look at them from a general perspective, but then they do have really small or major differences, which tell us that, yes, these people were connected somehow, they have something in common, but these differences tell us that this and this and this happened. And this is one of the main questions that archaeologists, especially Paleolithic archaeologists, like to look at. And to give one last example, apologies for all the lithics, I might be a bit biased. However, here we have the lithic technological cultures in Upper Paleolithic Europe, showing you how things change in time and how, for example, the movement of different lithic cultures can occur in time. And this is just one way to interpret it. And it's just a general picture of how the first step, which is lithic analysis in this case, can then be put onto a continental scale and extended through time to better understand aspects of cultural interaction and exchange. And for you, less Paleolithic prone people, another amazing example is the KULA ring. I suggest everyone to read The Gift by Moss, published in 1925. He was a French anthropologist and accounted this really neat system of ceremonial trading of shell ornaments, where very basically, I'm not going to get into detail, but for ceremonial reasons, people in Melanesia used to trade necklaces and arm shells, as you can see in the picture, and they would go opposite ways. And each item had a name because it represented a person, or it was inhabited by a soul, to better say. And each of these objects had a value. So to exchange, or if you wanted to trade items, you had to make sure to trade with a specific rate, and people would keep items for long enough so that they became more and more sought after. But this is very simply an example of cultural trading. And thankfully, it's ethnographic, so we know all the minute details. However, if you imagine finding this in an archaeological context, nowadays, if we went to these sites and excavated, we would only find these shell ornaments, and we would have absolutely no clue of the intricacies that existed when these shell ornaments were used. And in fact, some are still used. So just imagine how much information has actually been lost in the archaeological record, because we could theorize that many of the objects we've found and excavated up until today had as much of a powerful meaning as these items. However, we'll never know that. And although it might be a bit annoying and depressing at times to think about, it's always a really important thing to keep into consideration. And it's also a really useful thing to do for archaeologists and people interested or working in specific contexts, to always look within the ethnographic literature of a specific area, because many times great surprises can be found if that is done. So to conclude, we looked at very basic archaeological practices, but also how can we use them outside of archaeology? All of this can be used, and I think should be considered as one single word. Archaeology is a context. Of course, we do, I mean no harm, and I mean no offense, we do get a lot of information about the context of specific cultures or people from other disciplines. However, archaeology offers a huge array of information that can be used and that can make an interpretation and a publication that much more interesting and reliable. So archaeology, in other words, is context for anything that has to do with the human past and should always be taken into account. And to end, this shows the structure that I like giving to these 5 basic questions, where we have at the bottom the when, how, and what. These are the most direct and easy to analyze questions, but these should only be the fundamental to answer the main questions of what we're interested in, which is who and why. And with this, I would like to remind all of you that although I tried going as fast as I can, and I'll hopefully be going into more detail into the lecture about excavation and sampling methodologies, please keep an eye out for all these other great lectures that will go into much more detail into some of the topics I've discussed here. And of course, the lecture is not finished, but the recording will be ending soon, as the next part will be closed just for us. And I would like to thank you and take the opportunity, maybe the next 10-15 minutes, to answer any questions you would have before we go into the more in-detailed case study. So thank you very much. And Carly can ask you to stop the recording.